Um,
Wonderful.
I do think that one of the most interesting things about like urban core, whatever, urban aesthetic,
Yeah.
um, I'll see if this actually worked in a second, um, is that it makes me think about kind of like any like kind of um, like community made, okay, it does seem to be working, like community made aesthetic, like Bitcoin
Mm.
world, Ethereum world, whatever. Uh, I just wonder how the people, like, actually, the weird thing about those is that they were never really initially designed. And the elevator's going again. The elevator in the background is so cool. Uh,
Oh, it's fun. Yeah.
um, and yeah, we have like a different thing where there's like obviously like people obsessing about like how something is going to look, and then
Mm.
I don't know. Yeah, it's just a different. It's like a different thing. Yeah.
Yeah. It is a really interesting sort of point of, I don't even know if you could call it a point of tension, but I guess you could use that as a shorthand. But it's something that I remember bringing up in the foundation group actually is that there's this really, I think, overt effort on our part to be like, hey, in addition to building a place that is on one hand very comfortable and just sort of fully yours, just making sure that the place is also beautiful. It's a nice quality to sort of reach for. Um, I'm like reminded of how can recall some documentation of like the threads, like the email threads that led up to the design of Emacs's logo, with like the crazy calligraphy like
Oh, I don't know
animal.
about this.
It's just a funny story because it was such a messy process back in that time. That's all.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's ever done it quite the way that we're doing it, but I think
Mhm.
and I'm not saying that we've invented something. I mean, I think
Sure.
that's the thing that's interesting about like Urbit overall is that it's kind of like um, it's a kind of like unknown like organization type, you know?
Mhm.
Um, like,
Certainly.
yeah, no one actually knows what. I mean, there are kind of these like semi-decentralized institutions in the physical world,
Totally.
kind of, but they evolve over long periods of time. I don't know, it's just sort of a different thing. Um,
Yeah.
okay,
Absolutely.
we usually I feel like I used to do an intro, and I don't even know if, and the intro was just me saying, "Hey, what's up?" So
Mhm.
we basically skipped that, and I think that's fine. Uh, but the
Mhm.
point of these was actually, which I don't think I've ever talked about this. One of my favorite websites ever was the
Mhm.
Mother the agency. We might have talked about this. Their
I think so.
website
Yeah.
way back in the day, right, was just this. It was this weird QuickTime VR thing where you could walk around the office and people were just
Yeah.
working in the office. Do you remember this
Mhm.
thing? And then you would
Yeah.
click on someone and it would literally show you, I think, their passport with some of the information redacted. It didn't even tell you. It wasn't like, oh, like this is
Mhm.
Jamie and he's a brilliant whatever
Mhm.
like writer. It was just like their passport. It was just who
Like
they
here's this
were. But
individual.
yeah,
Yeah.
uh, and uh, I think when we were going to redo Tlon.io, yeah,
Mhm.
I was like, what should go on the people page? And then I was thinking, oh, it'd be cool to just be these are actually the people, not like, oh,
Mhm.
this is so and so. They have a title, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Exactly.
so someday we'll have a people page that'll just have all of these videos if I ever get around to doing it. I'm only on the fifth one that's taking forever to do them. Uh,
Yeah. We'll get there someday. That's
but
good. I
anyway,
feel like yeah, the vision there is awesome. It's fun.
I think it'll be fun if it actually works out. If we weren't trying to do a million things at once, like the thing to do would be to
Mhm.
like uh, you know put do them all in sequence and whatever, like actually do all 20 or something. But
Mhm. Mhm.
we'll see if that ever happens.
Yeah.
So I'm inclined to like.
Mhm.
All right, we know each other through kind of like extended arena world, I think,
I think so.
but
Yeah.
you've been in around or orbiting or whatever Urbit itself for a really long time. Probably
Mhm.
first talked to each other in any substantial way on Urbit itself
I
many
actually
years
think that's
ago.
completely true. Yes,
Yeah,
that's how we first really started speaking with one another, was through the network, which is kind of
yeah.
insane.
That's like the way that I feel like for anyone who's like, whenever people are like, oh, how can I work at Tlon? I'm like, I don't know, everyone works at Tlon just actually uses like step one, just actually use Urbit. I always feel a
Hmm.
little bad telling people that,
Hmm.
but it's totally true. Um,
Yeah, it is what it is. Yeah.
but yeah, I don't know what were you actually, there are some things. So I know that you worked at IBM. I know about like
Hmm.
IBM World.
Hmm.
I know a little bit about your like academic background, kind of, but actually not
Hmm.
really.
Yeah, no, I'm
So
happy to give everyone the lowdown of everything.
you can start with the
Um,
roguelikes you played as a kid or whatever. You start wherever you want.
Starting back in the day, yeah. I mean, I guess it helps to sort of provide a little bit of that context, but I feel like everyone has their own like this is how I learned to program story or whatever. And a lot of these days you see it's like, oh, some cutesy social network like Neopets back in the day taught me to program or whatever. And I think for me that sort of funny story does kind of lie in like game design. Like back in the day, you had things like RPG Maker, and I think that was really just sort of my first experience with actually desiring the capability to be like, oh, I like this environment that I'm creating to do X, Y, and Z number of things. So that's
Okay,
just like a
I don't know
little
anything.
nugget. Yeah.
So this is Matilda and I kind of got early
Hmm.
at the end of talking to Matilda about, especially about
Hmm.
like film and video stuff. It was
Hmm.
reminding me of this of yeah, what I've always felt like there's a sort of distinction in designers between people who think in narrative and people who think in systems.
Sure.
Um,
Sure. Yeah.
and like so yeah, my like introduction to making stuff was much more like, and I think I'm
Hmm.
just like I do think that someday this will just be, it's like there's a gene or something. Like it just feels like it's like a
Mm-hmm.
deeply deep difference.
Totally.
And I think you need both of them. But my interest is
Mm-hmm.
always more in like actually just in like structuring things. Like, well, so like
Mm-hmm.
like disassembling websites, putting them back
Mm-hmm.
together,
Mm-hmm.
but playing with the actual structure of it and like
Totally.
almost like non-narrative. So I don't
Mm-hmm.
know anything about how like RPG Maker. I feel like my experience with video games is I was always like, and I'm still like, I don't know how people make this.
Mm-hmm.
This is fucking crazy.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I'm with you there. I have to say though, like my own involvement in that whole world never got so deep. I don't think I ever got to the point where as like a kid I was like, oh, I'd love to be a video game designer someday.
Yeah.
I think admittedly I was a little bit too much of a realist to really think about that. But no, I do remember that discussion coming up in speaking with Matilda, and I have like a bit of a sort of take, I guess, if you even want to call it that. It's not like a serious one, but there's kind of like the expectation, that people operate differently accordingly to different mediums. And I absolutely agree that like there's sort of the Corbusiers of the world where it's like, oh, I'd like
Yeah.
to, think of the city as a story, the
Yeah.
sort of story of like the garden city that he was
Yeah.
obsessed with manifesting in all of his work. And then you do have the sort of other approach, which is all about, the materiality, the nuts and bolts, the literal metal, that a building is comprised of.
Yeah.
Um, and it's funny because like I can see how it would come off that maybe the way that I kind of operate in a lot of digital work or like sort of digital product design work does kind of appear as more narrative. But it's funny that you even outline the sort of story of like maybe how you came across or into design, where I feel like there does there is like a very sort of deep thread of being into stories and just how one tells the story of a given thing.
Yeah.
But my whole story of how I actually came into the sort of design profession is funny because both of my parents were in the medical field. Like they were doing
Yeah.
sort of like things that weren't like, it's not like doctor, like they weren't doctors or anything, but they did a lot of things related to like radiation and oncology and all of that. And so forever, for my entire childhood, I was basically just into like, oh, biology, medical stuff. And I was
Yeah.
basically just fully convinced near the tail end of high school that I would be doing something, going to
Yeah.
medical school or whatever.
Do you
And it
grow
was
up
really
going to the
funny.
lab?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah,
Yeah.
like I remember just spending a lot of time like in the basement of like Tucson Medical Center or whatever
Yeah.
with like my dad just like looking at all these machines and stuff.
Yeah.
And so for the longest time I was just convinced like, okay, this is what I'm doing. Like this is what I'm used to. Um, and hearing about, and that was what I was convinced I'd end up doing. But it wasn't until my mom actually came back from work one day with this really crazy story about how she was working with a designer at the hospital who was like building things out of foam and
Yeah.
prototyping things in the context of the hospital. And as she was telling me the story, it was like, I was a typical kid who liked playing with Legos and all that crap, and just liked putting things together. And just her telling the story, like kind of turned this whole story of being involved in the medical world like on its head for me. It's like rather than having to, mess with the nitty gritty of like learning math or biology or how bodies work, there was a completely sort of object level way of interacting with that world through like
Yeah.
designing things for the medical
Yeah.
industry. And so it was like in the last maybe 3 months of high school where I was like, okay, screw it. I'm not getting into, any medical sort of degree. I'd much rather go into the phrase or the word that she used to describe this individual designer working in the hospital, which was industrial designer. And I had never heard of the phrase before the story she was telling me. And after learning that this was an actual career someone could take on, I was like, hell yeah, I'll go to school to do that. So
Well, it was literally just
yeah,
one, just that's it. You were like,
yeah. I
you're like
mean,
in the course of an evening, you're like, done. Life,
changed
life
everything. Yeah.
changed. That's
Yeah, I
cool.
mean, it sounds silly, but like, I mean,
No, it's
like
great.
I was just completely like a nerd about like in school, just like putting things together and just I think the way that I kind of approach a lot of the work that I do is very heavily narrative, but a lot of it does come from the sort of more nuts and bolts. Like I like to sort of like put things together, and that's actually where a lot of sort of as we continue on this story of ed or whatever, getting into school, like the sort of curriculum of the industrial design school that I went to was very much involved in like the more mechanical engineering aspect of industrial design. It wasn't like art school where we were
Yeah.
learning how to like model the bodies of luxury vehicles. It was like, oh, how do you put plastics together to basically form a tube or something,
Yeah.
or how do you extrude materials? And so there was a
Yeah.
huge bent of that was really all about the sort of materiality, the supply chains, all the sort
Yeah.
of like nuts and bolts that go into making a cup or something. And that's
Yeah.
I'd like to still claim that like a part of me still calls myself an industrial designer. Like I'm very interested in that world, and
Yeah.
it's of course one of my dreams that eventually Tlon works in hardware.
Yeah.
But software is
Yeah.
where it's at right now. That's where the majority of the work lies. So
Yeah. I always think that
yeah,
like, yeah, everyone loves to that kind of a tangent, but the kind of like
yeah,
Apple,
yeah,
if anyone's here, or maybe it's the Alan Kay quote, right? Like anyone serious about
mhm.
computers or something, what is it? Anyone serious about computers builds their own hardware or something like that.
Yes,
But
absolutely.
I tend to think of it just like, yeah, like if you're serious about the, controlling the user experience, basically,
Hmm.
it's more like you need to control the whole stack, which is actually, I don't know. Anyway, we don't need to jump down this rabbit hole actually, but I
Yeah,
was like tend to think like,
yeah,
yeah, sure, you can make hardware, or it would be cool if I love the rise of the like sort of Raspberry Pi or Arduino world or whatever. Like I would love
absolutely. Yeah.
so much. I kind of miss the 90s in this regard, right? It's like I wish people
Hmm.
would just like build their own PCs out of commodity parts. Like, um, you had kind of like America and the West had, Shenzhen style electronics stores or something. And
Yes. Yeah.
so it's more about like, it's actually like the platform is what matters, right? It's like,
Hmm.
the computing platform matters a lot because you have to unify all these other pieces of hardware, but then people could customize their own hardware. Anyway, I don't
Hmm.
think that's happening anytime soon. And yeah, I mean, it would
Yeah.
be fun to do more hardware. So, okay, so
Yeah.
wait, so you went to industrial design school,
Hmm.
like, and in Arizona,
Hmm. Arizona
and
State. Yeah.
and you were thinking at that time of doing, what's the culture of industrial design school at Arizona State like? Because I have absolutely no idea. And like, what was the kind of stuff that you were making there? Or did you feel
Hmm.
like you had a good idea of what kind of like, it's obviously a big jump from like working on software or working on hardware stuff to working on software. In some ways not,
Absolutely.
obviously,
Yeah.
but yeah, like what's the kind of stuff you were thinking about then? And then like, what's the leap, I guess, right? Because at
Totally.
some point, yeah,
Yeah. Well, I think so. So I mean, it does sound kind of dramatic that I kind of leapt from just, oh yeah, I'll go to medical school and do biology or whatever, to jumping into like the design of physical products. And in a way it was, but I was still kind of like of that mind where like in sort of a typical Hippocratic Oath style of limitation, I was like, yes, I would love to contribute to the medical industry to some degree, build medical products. There's so much to be improved there.
was that like
Um,
an ethos around the house kind of thing? Like, I feel like that's an
yeah.
interesting, okay,
Yeah, yeah.
interesting.
No, this is something. This is totally derived just from my parents. I probably owe a lot of
Yeah,
that sort of thinking to them, really. But
it's
I mean,
interesting.
yeah, no, just like I had been just hanging around so much, like with them and their sort of their like what do you call it? Like the people they worked with, basically. Just always hear the grumblings about how
Yeah,
some bit of like wrapping that you would put around someone's neck to support them in an MRI machine was just terrible, and how they always had to hack around and sort of like fix things up themselves.
interesting.
So
But
yeah, it
the
was just
ethos
like
is like
yeah.
technology basically can improve, not only like
Mhm.
improve quality of life for people who are in whatever
Mhm.
medical, what in the hospital or some, or
Mhm.
like in some uh,
Mhm.
yeah, medical context, but also like potentially save people's lives or keep people alive, whatever, like
Yeah,
in a very
yeah,
like material way. Yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. So,
kind of
I
interesting.
had kind of like gone into university sort of under the sort of just, pre-knowledge that that's basically what I would end up, dedicating my life to. And
Yeah,
I guess like how that funneled into the specific culture of ASU, as I mentioned, it's kind of like an old school bit of curriculum, like very sort of nuts and bolts, like how do you get materials into a specific form.
yeah,
And the first 2 years of school were interesting in that the first year is actually they take anyone who wants to apply to the class, so to speak, or to
yeah,
the degree, where it's like, hey, we'll take all 200, 300, 400 people who want to do industrial design, and we'll just like let them in. And the
yeah,
first year of curriculum is effectively how to draw lines, how to draw
yeah,
boxes, how to do perspective, how to basically do all that drafting that you would expect with like how to
yeah,
sort of orthographically present um, sort of material knowledge.
yeah,
Um, so a lot of it was just like very basic. I think that a lot of architecture and art schools have that in common. And the sort of weird, the differentiation, I think, in the way that ASU handled its design school curriculum for industrial design was that they actually had a cutoff where they would only accept like 50 people out of that initial pool. So you kind of ended up with a really specific cutthroat culture where
yeah,
people were in studio around the clock. It wasn't like I think Art Center, which is a great example of how they basically just pre-gate
Yeah.
the curriculum, and it's like we only let 50 people in at a time. There was kind of just like this terrible, in retrospect, just like race to be like the best drafter, the best
Yeah.
renderer, whatever, just because it was so inherently competitive. So went through that whole process. Obviously, you made it through just fine, which was happy in retrospect. The second year was kind of an extension of that initial year of sort of basic work, where we learned how to do a lot of the prior work, but in sort of the computer context, how to assemble things in 3D, how to use SolidWorks, all that good stuff. And then typically the way that the third and fourth years panned out was just to work on projects that were applying that
Yeah. Yeah.
knowledge. And just to skip all that crap, because a lot of it is just really what you'd expect out of school, the capstone project that I ended up working on was effectively a medical device, a catheter actually. So I was working with like an engineering student, a graphic design student, and a business school student from ASU as a part of
Okay,
this
got it.
like business school minded initiative to basically create like a real product. And
Yeah.
so this was like, you can imagine up the line of continuation about being interested in medical objects.
Yeah.
I managed to sort of keep that throughout all of school, and it manifested in a really interesting way where we were just trying to figure out how to make like a very human-centered,
Yeah.
very friendly, sort of like keeping or maintaining dignity sort of product when it came to
Yeah. Yeah.
how someone who is a paraplegic or a quadriplegic might use a catheter
Yeah.
or what have you. So there's really not much else to say there.
So,
You can just kind of see the
obvious
journey, but
connection. It's like straight
yeah,
from that to Urbit. Like,
yeah,
I mean.
exactly.
uh,
Yeah,
so
so
wait, so
like
yeah, where did you? But you leave Air at some point. You get out. You're out of Air.
yes.
Arizona. I mean, that's a pretty total.
Mhm.
That's a very. It seems like a pretty classic like
Mhm.
ID kind of like curriculum, especially
Of
like
course,
from
yeah.
the sort of like point line plane through to like
Hmm.
execution at the sort of product level.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
yeah, but what happens after?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
this is where it gets funny. This is where we can actually
Okay.
reach the sort of leaping off point. So throughout the latter end of industrial design school, for me at least, there is this whole period of time when one opens up their knowledge, does internships, all that, and
Yeah.
learns that industrial design is just a very small pool of what is possible in the greater sort of design consulting universe. And this is
Yeah.
when you learn about like IDEO and Frog and all of these other sort of multi
Yeah.
like talented sort of generalist sort of
Yeah.
positions one sort of integrate themselves in as an industrial designer.
Yeah.
And at the tail end of my own schooling, I was kind of tuned in to the efforts of some of the alumni who were teaching at the industrial design school who were working for IBM, and how
Yeah.
IBM was basically starting a sort of similar in the spirit of IDEO or Frog, like a multidisciplinary
Okay. Yeah.
sort of program, basically, because they wanted to inject designers into what had at that time been a very engineering-led
Yeah.
company.
Yeah.
I think the number at that time was like 1,000 engineers to a single designer, which was a
Yeah.
ridiculous ratio.
Yeah.
So, as just like just skipping ahead of a lot of the details associated with that, I learned about all of this world, happened to have that connection, and was able to sort of make the application into IBM under the impression that I would still be doing industrial design, but ended up very, very quickly realizing that that actually wasn't something that IBM wasn't doing anymore,
Yeah.
and ended up basically transitioning into UX design work, as it was termed, through that whole sort
Oh,
of
got it.
process. Yeah.
But that's like whole like learning a different tool chain, probably, right?
Oh,
Like,
it was terrible.
yeah.
It was horrendous. This was
Right.
like prior to Sketch existing. This was prior
Yeah. Yeah.
to Figma existing. We were literally using like Photoshop and
Yeah. Yeah.
Illustrator to make interfaces and stuff like
Oh,
that.
I
So it was terrible.
remember. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm familiar with those days. Uh,
Oh yeah.
okay, that makes sense. And actually, the context of doing that within like a giant company actually is kind
Hmm.
of nice. Like that's good, kind of like grad school, in a way.
Yeah.
Like, because
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
can learn all those
Exactly.
tools like
Hmm.
with some kind of like leeway or something. It's like not a super. It's not like being in a startup or something like that.
Yeah. No, and that's exactly how I rationalized it to myself. Where it was like, oh, rather than having to pay out of my pocket to like go to grad school, like this was a
Yeah.
perfect sort of
Yeah, that
replacement for
makes
that.
sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and there really isn't too much to tell about the IBM story. It's corporate design. It's all B2B work. You obviously learn a lot in a context like that. But that was actually how I ended up discovering Urbit, funnily enough, which was in the context of sort of being involved in this
Oh, I
world,
didn't
learning
realize that.
about like new technologies. I was able to like learn about this completely randomly,
Yeah.
about this sort of crazy project
Did
that
you
was
just
all
find this
about
on?
reinventing what a computer was.
Yeah, how did you find out about Orbit? Actually, I don't think I know that.
Yeah, so the discovery itself was just sort of through the grapevine of Arena at the time. So was
Okay. Yeah.
still kind of like a big Arena user around the time that this existed, but
Yeah.
was just plugged into other people's research on like what new ways of organizing interfaces was, all that whole stuff, and just sort
Yeah.
of happened to stumble upon it through that context. and
I
just
guess that
like,
makes sense.
join in and
I mean,
everything.
Arena
Yeah,
at that time was really small,
it was.
probably I would
Yes,
expect, because this is like 2014, 2015 or something like
it
that.
was.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, around that
yeah,
sort of span of time. Yeah,
yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, but then you got, wait, where were you when you were working for IBM? Because you also
So
got
that was that
uprooted
was that
and,
was in Texas. Yeah,
yeah,
Austin. Mhm.
right. Okay, okay, got it. And then I didn't realize that these things are so like sort of like closely connected or something. I mean, was
Mhm.
it, I guess at what point, like by the time that we were talking to each other more
Mhm.
regularly, so probably more like 2016, 2017 or something like that, like
I think so.
obviously
Yeah.
like interface and like the power of actual like just like digital interface, I feel like was
Hmm.
something you were thinking about a lot more. So I think the
Absolutely.
thing I'm like, I can kind of see the thread from like, well, I mean, if you're thinking about really practical,
Hmm.
like medical devices, which have like this very, clear impact on the people that
Hmm.
use them, that can like anchor your thinking in a certain kind of like, I don't know, approach to making things, maybe, I guess.
Yeah.
But I wonder like when like how your thinking changed and thinking about that as like something that's
Hmm.
can be software based also,
Yeah.
and maybe like
Yeah.
how that works in terms of like internet culture, because I also think of you as someone who's like pretty embedded in sort of internet culture like in general,
Hmm.
which obviously is not a thing really
Hmm.
in industrial I feel like industrial
It
design actually
isn't.
has kind of like a
It
totally
absolutely
different
isn't.
culture.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It
So
absolutely, yeah. Everyone, and literally everyone I went to school with has no idea what the hell I'm doing these days.
right.
There's like a zero connection there. I don't know. I feel like in a way these are kind of two parallel paths, which is like there was a sort of arc of my life where I was very interested in sort of building things for human bodies, so to speak, for forever. Like that's always
Yeah.
been sort of like a an element of just who I am. And the whole internet thing was really this whole other facet of me that was just like, oh, I'm interested in video games, interested in the internet. I like going on, forums and other
Yeah.
things. And just there was always that sort of like parallel interest that was always juggled throughout life.
Yeah.
So finding that way to sort of synthesize the two in how software design worked was really just kind of like a really lucky, I think, in my case, or something I had always been really interested in doing for the longest time. Um,
Do you
yeah,
think
it's
that
like,
happened while you were, yeah, I'm still not, maybe it's just like,
mhm,
it's just one of those things or something. Like, I feel
mhm.
like, I mean, it's, well, did you like, were you avidly and actively like on the internet as a kid? You know what I mean? Like, was
Yeah,
internet culture
totally.
kind of just like a through line? I guess,
I th-
like, maybe
I think
that's
it
like
was a
what,
through line. Yeah, I mean, if I can like trace some of the earliest like interest, like through lines that I had, there's kind of the natural progression of like, oh, booting up a Windows 95 computer for the first time, being
yeah,
interested in games through that way, finally getting that actually connected to like a dial-up internet and being able to
yeah,
explore
yeah,
AOL for the first time.
yeah,
And it gets a little bit fuzzy here, but if I recall distantly, like I think around that time I had taken on like a very specific interest in like, oh, messaging platforms. There's like games that integrated that. You
yeah,
had things like Neopets, which were kind of like a natural extension of communicative social sort of environments paired with
yeah,
games. And then
yeah,
things like, of course, like, one learns about like 4chan and like all these other like very
yeah,
specific like communities online.
yeah,
And so you just like have this like through line where I was just kind of like making that journey through internet culture, as a result of living in Arizona and being interested in things like at the time during like college, like Disc Magazine was a big thing for me. Tumblr was a really
yeah,
big
yeah,
thing for me. Learning
yeah.
about cultures through these various sort of spheres was always continually very interesting to me.
Yeah, Dis, man. I remember Dis
Yeah,
magazine.
that was huge. Yeah, no, for me that was exceedingly huge. Like as
Interesting.
kind of like a sort of budding musician at the time, just like as a hobby. You like learn
Yeah,
about these weird internet cultures and like, oh, how can I apply
yeah.
myself or make my mark in this world? So this was
That's
all
interesting.
happening sort of alongside just traditional design pursuits and all of
Yeah,
that good
yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, Dis is a weird. Dis was. I wonder if Dis still
Mhm.
exists.
I feel like they
Uh,
have this like dis.art platform, but it's like nothing
yeah,
like the sort of original vibe of
yeah,
the first takes on it.
that makes sense.
It was special. It was a very special time, I think, on the internet at that time.
I didn't. Yeah, it was more like it was kind of like adjacent. I feel like I was like aware of it and knew some people in that world a little. I feel like I knew about it
Hmm.
more because I was in New York at that time and kind of like knowing it
Hmm.
like as a social thing more than like.
Yeah.
I'm like trying to remember the actual content. I have like sort of like it's like very vague. memory. But
Yeah.
wait, you somehow got transit. Did you move to New York to work for Tumblr? Because at some point
Y-
you got sucked into
Yeah.
Tumblr orbit, which maybe you're like, I don't even want to talk about Tumblr.
Well, I mean,
Uh,
I loved the people that I worked with with all my heart, and I
yeah,
don't really have like negative things to say about it. But I mean, the sort of very small story to tell about that was that, IBM was like a coming out of school experience. It was like this is my
yeah,
first experience, like chance at a job. This is my first experience of professional culture,
yeah,
and in a way, like after 3 or so years of working at that, I just had this sort of natural reaction for someone who is probably of that age to be like, well, this sucks. I kind of want to try something completely different. And
yeah,
so the way that I sort of rationalized it was that you had this sort of hyper corporate context of IBM. I was
yeah,
seeking in my life something completely opposite to that or
yeah,
antithetical to that, and I found that in Tumblr more or less. And as a result of that, was just able
yeah,
to
yeah.
move from Texas to New York, which is
Right.
where I still find myself, and just like learned a lot about through Tumblr, like just the ways that sort of how the sausage is made, so to speak, when it comes to a social network, like all the things around
Yeah,
moderation, all the sort of drama associated with that and all
yeah.
that good stuff.
Well,
And
you
just
were
like,
there
yeah,
late in Tumblr's life in some ways, right? Like I think of that.
I would say
I think
so.
I,
Yeah.
I think I remember when you were like, I think you were at Tumblr probably when we first talked to each other, and I was
Yeah,
like,
definitely.
Tumblr is still around?
It's like, yes, this like the rotting like care space of Tumblr. Yeah. No, I would
Yeah,
definitely say that it was during the tail end of its life. Like, at least, I mean, this is like me speaking obviously of my own sort of POV, but
yeah,
at that time, like the design team was dissipating, everyone was leaving off to do their own thing, and I
yeah,
just felt a really like uh, specific sense of the spirit of the place dying. So
yeah, yeah.
that was when I just hightailed it out of there. Ended up doing consulting for a while, and I think that's when I ended up formally landing in the context of doing like Urbit related work, which was
Oh
something I had
yeah,
been
yeah,
like fixating on or ideating about for quite a while.
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you had because you have a star from like the first time
The
we ever
very
sold
first
outer
one,
space,
yes.
right? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
good times.
which is yeah, that was quite a while ago. Um,
Mm,
Yeah, it's pretty
yeah.
simple actually. It's funny. I felt like I thought I was like I think did something else. Anyway, I think
Mm.
I thought there was some intermediate period of ed that I like didn't know about that I actually isn't
No, I feel
there.
like you have a really good
Yeah,
take on it. Yeah, like I had been talking to you, I believe, through command line Urbit through when
yeah,
I was still at IBM, just like whenever I had off time, which was
yeah.
frequent
That's
in
true.
a
Yeah,
company
yeah.
like
And then
that. Yeah.
well, it's interesting because then there are other IBM people who got interested in Urbit, and I remember thinking
Mhm.
that was IBM is such a weird and gigantic place. Um,
Yeah, it's
uh,
basically a city. Yeah,
it's so big, and anyway, I mean, at that point, Urbit was like purely pseudonymous, right? And so it was also
purely. Mhm.
confusing because I would like talk to other people who ended up being at IBM, and I was like, wait, are these people all like working together or something? I have no idea.
Totally.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you must have also like, I feel like moving to New York must have been a pretty mind blowing shift in
Oh,
kind of like
absolutely.
everything, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Like
Uh,
while I was still doing formal sort of industrial design stuff, I managed to make it out here for an internship working for Smart Design, the company that does like OXO and all those like home goods.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
it wasn't that Newark was a completely new experience, and I think that that experience sort of further fixated my desire to live there,
Yeah.
um, which has long since dissipated. It's like I could exist anywhere at this point.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it was actually a very huge change. I think just in terms of like living and just being embedded in a place for sure. Like Austin
Yeah.
and New York are obviously completely different from one another.
Yeah. That's interesting. Do you feel like you like find the design culture there at all to be kind of like something that's still like when you say you can live anywhere, is it also because you feel like somewhat disconnected from the like, I don't know, the value of like, yeah, a specific
Mhm.
community or specific place in terms of its like design culture or whatever? I mean, I
Yeah, I mean,
definitely do. Like, I there was
mhm.
definitely a point where I was just like, okay, I actually don't. It's not like I have a community of people that I'm connected to, but I don't feel like I need to be out and about or whatever. But
No, I think that's like an accurate mapping. I think when you sort of enter into a place with this sort of mythos of like a design culture sort
yeah,
of encompassing it, I
yeah,
think that you find your sort of ways in there to whatever degree you deem necessary. I
yeah,
think that in encountering the people at Tumblr who like I had known about these individuals, like the designers that were working there before I ever joined, and so it was
yeah,
very explicitly a move to work with people that I found very cool.
yeah,
Through those people, you find other cool people. You find sort of pockets of cool people that you keep
yeah,
with you no matter where you are. And I think really, you come to a point, at least speaking for myself, where it's like, well, it turns out young Ed was kind of naive, and what he was really looking for was specific individuals to sort of align around. And so
Yeah.
you find that it's like, well, I'm here because I'm here, and it turns out that in sort of the various weird internet pools or just cultures that I've been involved in, I have very much found, I think, that sort of distributed network of people that exist in a lot of places, really.
It's a
So
weird, yeah, I know what you mean. It's really strange. I think like
mhm,
kind of like moving on from the myth that there is,
mhm,
well, so I think in the pre-internet, like one of the weird things about design history,
mhm,
architecture, I mean, even some of art history too, is that like
mhm.
the sort of movements of the past were much more physically contiguous because like the internet
Absolutely.
wasn't a
Mhm,
thing.
mhm.
Um, and so that I think biases is easy to then have it bias you towards being in a particular place. Like
Yes.
everyone after school was over for me, everybody or like so many people moved to Berlin, and I remember thinking like, huh, maybe is that like
Yeah.
is that important thing to do?
Yeah.
And
No, I mean,
I mean,
it was the same for me. Yeah.
I
Mhm,
mean, maybe, like maybe, but I'm actually not now with a little bit more time, like a little bit further down the line. I'm not sure,
mhm.
if it really matters that much, basically.
Yeah, I mean, coming out of school for me, like the industrial design cities of choice were obviously like the Smart Designs or other consultancies of New York and
Yeah,
like the IDEOs of San Francisco. Like I have
yeah,
so many people that I went to school with who are still embedded in San Francisco, and
yeah,
I always try to like visit them every time I'm out there. And
yeah,
I feel like for industrial design, that actually may still be true. There are still sort of like the pockets
yeah,
of locales that are sort of more deeply involved in what is like a very small industry, I think, in
yeah,
terms of like the people who do design and industrial design. It's kind of like a fast fading, uh, practical realm of work to actually work in.
yeah,
But like immediately jumping into sort of digital design or internet design, I think you quickly find that becomes kind of completely destroyed as a notion. Like I
yeah.
remember feeling very very hesitant about moving to Texas from Arizona, even though they're kind of similar in a lot of ways. I was like, I'm ending up in Texas, not in New York, where I want to be.
Yeah,
And yeah, I kind of learned very quickly that Texas is actually sick. So
yeah.
yeah.
I believe that. Yeah, I feel like that probably would have been. I was so like, I mean, I grew up kind of like outside of like right in the sort of external, whatever, the fringe of the Bay Area,
Mhm.
and I mean, for the funny thing is that I mean, I was like, I have to get out of here as soon as possible. Like I
Yeah, totally.
must go to big city and be as
Hmm.
far away
Hmm.
from my family as
I,
possible.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I feel
uh,
that.
and obviously, I've come back and I'm happy to be closer to family
Hmm.
and to be closer to stuff that I'm like familiar with and less of like big city world. But
Hmm.
yeah, it's like the first thing you need to understand where all those like clicks. I mean, I also like yeah, like went to work for people who yeah, my first real jobs were like with people who I um, was sort of through that kind of like, oh, like these are designers that I think are really cool or like are interesting.
Hmm.
Um, and like I mean, I went to school later, so I sort of did it the other way around,
Hmm.
basically.
Got it. Got it.
Um, but yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting to think about like those kinds of scenes and then related to, I've been thinking about how like we as a company and like as a project, like working on
Hmm.
basically like purpose built somewhere like kind of I'm not even sure like purpose built software, which
Hmm.
I think sort of lives between I don't know if it's consumer software or enterprise software or whatever, but basically like
Yeah.
software that's actually just explicitly supposed to be useful and isn't
Hmm.
doesn't survive by reselling itself to you or whatever. Need a
Yes.
better definition for this, but like
Hmm.
uh, one of the things that like when I started, I think to think about this more seriously, even before I was working on Urbit, like related to this sort of like clicks conversation, there's no click,
Hmm.
there's no like physical place, there's no like, I'm like, okay, who knows about this? I'm like people from
Hmm.
like 30 years ago. I mean, in some ways, actually, like coming
Yeah.
back to the Bay Area, I was like, oh, this is the only place that has any kind of like DNA, like
Hmm.
of basically kind of like actual computing and not
Hmm.
like fake computing or whatever. Uh,
No, I know
uh,
what you mean. Yeah.
but it's still actually kind of problematic because it's really hard to
Hmm.
take people out of the sort of design culture of like, hey, I build apps or whatever,
Hmm.
which are
Hmm.
basically just vehicles for advertising to you or holding you captive or whatever, and say, no,
Hmm.
no, no, please make something that's useful. It's like that's really hard to do. It's a weird
Yeah.
thing. There's like not much of like a culture of it. I mean, it's a little bit. Not really. I don't know.
No, I understand where you're coming from. It's like, I think just this, I mean, this is actually something that I've been trying to, whenever I kind of get the time, is to sort of figure out what that exact definition of what personal software in this day and age actually means. Because you had the whole
Yeah.
movement and the whole notion of romanticized of like the personal computer. It's like now I
Yeah.
have, a world in my house or whatever.
Yeah.
And just given the way things are so hyper connected these days and just sort of networking is the norm, it kind of
Yeah.
brings to mind like, well, how do you even discuss what like something that is personal actually is these days? And this
Yeah.
kind of leads a little bit into that discussion that I will admit is like very esoteric on the surface that you got into with Matilda a little bit, which is
Yeah.
that one's computer is of one's body, so to speak. Which I
Yeah.
don't have to get into that because that's really its own sort of rant-worthy topic. But I
Feel
think
free.
it just remains to be taken seriously that these things that we kind of rely on at this point to get business done, to talk to friends and family, to do work. It's all extensions of self in a way, but not really because things are their own apps, their own platforms. They all
Yeah.
belong
Yeah.
to everything but yourself. And it's just I feel like it is really the core of the
It
problem,
could
so to
be
speak,
worth.
that we're working on.
Yeah, I think in this, like, there's this very, it's like in another era, right? You would have written a manifesto with like 10 bulletin points about like, do you know what I mean? Like,
Oh
this
geez,
is
yeah,
like what it means for a software to be truly personal.
yeah,
And
yeah.
like, you'd be like a futurist about it. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, you'd have that kind of
I know
like,
exactly what you mean. Yeah, yeah. That's
which
wild.
actually might not be a totally bad idea.
Yeah.
But I think I always end up getting hung up on like, no one, I don't expect an ordinary person to care about this. But it
Hmm.
might be
Hmm.
useful in terms of galvanizing kind of like designers or consumers, Um,
Yeah. Yeah, that's the
not,
thing.
no, no,
It's
not consumers,
it's
like purely like design. Like I'm saying, like for the people who make this stuff, I do
mhm,
think it's like important to be clear about like what is the kind, like what are sort of the rules of the game very
mhm.
broadly. And like what are you kind of like trying to optimize for or something like that? Or
Yeah,
yeah, I don't know.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's funny you mentioned that too, because I think there really is a very distinct messaging that needs to happen maybe for the greater community of people who are building up this thing that we're calling Urbit, this new networked computer network. It's there's like this story that one needs to basically relay to the group of people who are kind of like rallying around, what does really new software and new computation look like? And then there's
Yeah,
a story that is so much more municipal. It's like so much more work a day where it's like, well, people just want things to work and to get things done. And
yeah,
actually, it turns out that, the way that people use computers right now is hyper predatory and just like, really bad. And
yeah,
maybe necessarily isn't that much better than it would be otherwise if you were to actually, own your own server or whatever. So
yeah,
there's just like a
yeah. I
lot of
mean,
stories going to be told here for sure.
right. So I do think like one of the things that I was realizing.
Mhm.
Actually, this is, so it's a weird, I was like, I don't know what channel this came in through, but I think I just
Mhm.
always been meaning to read the Everything Store, the book on Amazon.
Oh, yeah,
'Cause
yeah.
I don't really
Mhm.
know anything about Amazon. Like, I mean, like I'm aware of Amazon's existence or whatever, but I don't know anything that much about the history of the company.
Yeah, likewise.
Um, and one of the things that's kind of cool is to go back and watch, and this came up again when Bezos stepped down the other day, is like go back and watch Amazon, him like pitching Amazon in the late 90s.
Mhm.
Um, we can like put this in the show notes or whatever, and I can send it to you
That'd be
later.
fun,
But
yeah.
he's so, it's so simple, like he's basically like, this is just about, like we're just trying to do what the customer wants, as we're trying to serve the customer as best we possibly can. Like they're just like, he's just like, we're a customer service company, it's better to buy
Mhm.
things on the internet and we can make this like an incredible experience. But it's just like all about,
Mhm.
it has nothing to do with, obviously Amazon's a technology and logistics company and there's all this infrastructure, but at the end of the
Mhm.
day it's just about like what the consumer wants. Worth
Yeah.
mentioning, like there's something deeply in sort of slightly insane about that, because like what the customer like does, what are the effects of someone
Exactly.
like
Yep.
only serving what the customer wants. I think there's
Mhm.
something suspicious about that, but it made me think about how like I think people are like, well, like this Urbit thing is weird,
Mhm.
why is it like this? And I was thinking about how I'm like, well, it's like this because you want to be able to just like build software, yeah, that just does exactly what it says it does, and it doesn't do
Yes.
anything else, and it actually lasts a long time, and it actually belongs to you. And that's it's actually all about user experience. It's just about, this is a
Mhm.
really nice experience of computing. Basically, it's like a much better experience of computing than any of the alternatives. So that
Mhm.
we've always made this mistake, I think, of talking about the technology too much and not just talking about the fact that you're just trying to make a really nice
Yeah,
computer.
like the end result.
Um,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
I mean, it's one of the things too where like what this gets me thinking about are a couple of sort of discussions I've been having with people in the community about how, at the end of the day, while it is sort of the more boring thing and not hype generating thing to talk about, that sort of infrastructural element of Urbit that does inevitably lend itself to the fact that I'm just having a pleasant experience at the tail
yeah,
end is so important of a story to sort of maintain, possibly internally, because frankly, um, people don't care about infrastructure. It's like,
yeah,
when you have the iPhone, you care about having the most precisely machined
yeah,
consumer good ever produced in the history of the
yeah, yeah.
universe.
Yeah, but Urbit
And
is
it's
already
not,
like
yeah,
that. Like, I think
yes,
that's like, I
yes.
think like it's like if you want to
That,
send
yeah,
the
it's already
most
there.
deluxe
Yeah,
chat
yeah,
messages in the world, you know what I mean? You can like, your chat message has been, actually, we need to add a feature to chat where you can like see the compiled knock that gets sent over the
yes. Oh
wire
my
or
God,
something
like
like
the
that. Like,
actual, the atoms, yes. Oh my
oh,
God.
but it's like that's the chamfer. Like it's the equivalent of like,
Mhm.
those videos where you get to see the aluminum being milled or something like
Just,
that,
yes, exactly.
Um,
Yeah. Oh my God.
uh,
It's a great idea for a video.
anyway, I think there's also something to that that has to do with being able to also state the kind of the ethos of doing things that way, which is,
Mhm.
uh, I actually kind of I can't sometimes I can't tell whether there are other people who kind of get it or like no one gets it.
Mhm.
But in
Mhm.
general, it would be better if it could be well defined. As a kind of like this is kind of the right way
Yeah.
to think about
I
building
mean,
software.
I do feel like there is sort of equivalency that could be brought to bear here, where there's always that quote about people painting the backside of fences because even though the public doesn't see it, that you did the due diligence to do it.
Yeah,
Where if we could basically really heighten that sort of popping open the hood of
yeah,
one's interface or one's computer and see like a very nicely machined like array of numbers that basically purely represent that thing. Like
yeah,
something that I've been joking around about or using as a point of reference is this notion of resin identification codes at the bottom of like any single plastic object that you can find in the world, where you
yeah,
can kind of like lift up a cup and see, oh, this thing is like you know, it's like some sort of polymer, or it's
yeah,
like peat. And through that knowledge, they don't really do it very well in the form of physical objects. But if you have that knowledge of like what like polyethylene is and where it comes from, you kind of can almost visualize at that moment, the supply chain
yeah,
or how this thing was formed. And there's like something very beautiful, very poetic there that isn't something otherwise so boring
yeah.
and of the supply chain, which I think could be really fun to explore in the sort of digital context, where it's like, oh, I'm aware of like where these bits come from, more or less, or the path that they've taken on to where I am.
I mean, it
That could be really
reminds me
fun.
though of the like, yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I like that idea. I'm always skeptical of these things because they require that you create this kind of like imaginary armature for the person involved, right? It's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I don't remember who was making it's like or it just reminds me immediately of the like NFT art thing where it's like
Oh God,
anyone
yeah.
can look at my thing, but I own the like I'm the person who has the whatever owns the key to it, and I'm like,
Mm.
okay, like it's pretty abstract. Like I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah,
sure.
yeah.
You have to tell this whole story and create this culture around I own the key to it. I mean, if it's, I,
Mm.
maybe, maybe. Like I'm actually like, okay, maybe.
No,
But
I
I
hear
think
you. It's
like,
like,
yeah,
yeah. I mean, I don't expect the populace of a future Urbit to be people who look on the bottom side of their cups to see where it came from. But
yeah, yeah. Well, there's something, but I think
yeah.
that's like the interesting thing about the Apple ethos, of course, is that you're trying to surface that in these very specific ways
Mm.
that are felt, right? Like that are
Yes.
literally, tactically, or like they're
Mm.
tactile,
Mm.
they just use like haptic responses, and
Yes. The haptic
I,
work is especially good here as a reference.
yeah, I think like that you could do. I mean, you already have some of that. Like in the current experience of using Urbit, most of that exists by what's not there, right? It's more about what's not
Mm.
there than what's there.
Mm.
And I think that's powerful, but I don't know if I think we can probably make it more like palpable, basically,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I
but
was
it's
just in a
interesting to think
meeting.
about.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was actually just in a meeting this morning, funnily enough, describing sort of what that Tlon ethos may be, or how it
Yeah,
may be construed to sort of the normal person, the everyday person, which is
yeah,
that you could almost imagine, this isn't a company official statement, but you could almost imagine that what Tlon is in the business of currently doing through Landscape is the sort of construction of digital basics, so to speak. It's like people
yeah, yeah,
wear jeans, they wear t-shirts, they wear these basic things that are just comfortable and easy to wear, And you
Yeah.
can almost imagine a lot of what landscape is like a construing of that, which was that people who use the internet expect to be able to chat to people. They expect
Yeah.
to be able to collect things or just bookmark things or do any number of very basic things. And rather than
Yeah.
imagining any sort of Tlon effort as being like, oh, we're going to build like the NFT sticker oriented Twitch, something very hyper like specific and almost maximal in a way, we're
Yeah.
just trying to make a comfortable place. Like this is like the comfy zone before maybe going on the expedition that is exploring the deeper aspects of what using like an Urbit computer, could be. So it's like
Yeah.
one way of
Yeah.
thinking about it, maybe.
I mean, I think that's fair. Yeah, sure. It's like, or I think it's obvious that certainly like the ethos of the company is sort of is Muji like in that way, where like we want to build really high quality,
Mm-hmm.
straightforward kind of like prototypical things that
Yeah,
are
yeah,
like
definitely.
nice because they're very prototypical, but it's very
Mm-hmm.
different from like Urbit itself, which of course is just is infrastructure to do all kinds of things. You
Mm-hmm.
can make as maximal of a thing as you would like. It would actually
Exactly,
be
exactly.
easier to articulate that if we need to build a couple of very maximalist. You need NFT sticker Twitch
Exactly,
on
exactly. And
Urbit, which actually is doable probably, but yeah,
this is why I've been goading some people in the extended development community to be like, yes, we need like, games. I think games are the huge one here, where it's like
yeah,
everyone I think remembers using Solitaire or MS Paint or Minesweeper for the first time. And
yeah,
while maybe that's like not a thing that we could lean into, maybe we could, if we find some time. But it's like if people could begin to develop a culture around what P2P games feel like on this new
yeah,
system,
yeah.
that could be amazing. It could be so crazy.
Yeah,
And
it's.
just
I mean,
like
it's
very
definitely. Yeah,
fun.
I agree. The gaming thing we've talked about this a little
Hmm.
bit. Like games is super
Yeah.
interesting because having like the network and identity and authentication that's like already there is such a different foundation to start thinking about how you build
Yeah.
games.
So much is
Um,
built in. Yeah, it's true.
but it also just creates different like social dynamic. It's so
Hmm.
different. It's also so different than like anything that you would use that has to like build its own network and has its own multiplayer and has its own whatever. Um,
Yeah.
uh, yeah, I still think of the like kind of like Animal Crossing-y, like just some way that you have like a sort of spatial experience of like you being in your orbit and all the
Hmm.
neighbors that you peer with, or something to
Yes.
that extent. It's like you just need some way of being able to just experiencing this kind of like network native thing. Uh,
Hmm.
It'd be also really cool to be able to see that as like overlapping between um,
Hmm.
different mediums, like between like a chat or a group. Like you're
Yeah.
in a group and that same group gets reused in a different
Yeah.
like a gaming context or whatever.
I mean,
Um,
that reminds me of like one of the very first sort of experiences that really drew me into the general sort of system was the experience of using that mud that was
yeah, yeah,
initially developed back when everything was a command line experience.
yeah,
Like this is kind of a story that I tell a lot of people who ask about like how I first encountered this system that is Urbit. And there's like this metaphor that I'm always using where it's just funny to explain where as I approached it, this software, and installed it on my machine and everything, I almost felt that I was very tactically encountering like a block of like brass or marble, just something very
yeah,
like impenetrable to a degree, but like very sort of like satisfying to hold. Like, you lift a little block of marble, like a
yeah,
tchotchke or something, and it just feels so cool.
yeah,
And there's like a very specific feeling here where it was like, oh, encountering this chat client that was hyper slow at the time, but that had the ability to like sort of change the context from just a chat into like a mud, which was just like magical. Like that was insane to me to be able to
yeah,
sort of
yeah.
encounter that. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that you want that. I mean, that feeling of like it being dense or heavy or carefully
Mhm.
constructed is super important thing to focus on.
Yeah.
Also, making sure that you want to communicate in like very like
Mhm.
non-trivial or like non-superficial ways, basically, right? You want it to like feel
Absolutely. Yeah.
real, basically. I
Mhm.
think that's I mean, it's really hard to do. I mean, in many ways, like I mean,
Absolutely.
Urbit as an interface is super young. It's just so young by comparison to like the system itself. I mean, or landscape,
Mhm.
and so it. I feel like landscape doesn't yet construe that fully because
I agree.
it's
Mhm.
just early. Um,
Yeah, it's a sort of classic problem that you encounter when you sort of describe the process of designing software versus something like hardware or a physical object or even like a bit of architecture is that there's like the physical realization, like
yeah,
there's a sort of crystallization that happens with a product, um, which with software almost is it's like water. The way that at least popular software is generally developed is like this free flowing thing. Code goes in and out things break because millions of viewports exist, and there's like a very hard guarantee to be made for ensuring the solidity of interface design, which I know we sort of strive for, but
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like this universally difficult thing to solve for, you know? It's like if someday we developed Urbit hardware, or like Tlon hardware specifically, if we kept that sort of like ratio of the screen size the same, so that it was like
yeah,
a canvas you could infinitely draw on forever and not have
yeah,
to
yeah.
worry about, you know, resizing, that could be an interesting sort of proof of case or a proof of that sort of like ethos there. But it's
Yeah,
always
you
going to
can
be a
do
hard
that.
problem, I feel.
You can do that always on like different layers, right? I mean, this is why we spend so much time talking about like different rendering techniques, or like whether you can
Hmm.
kind of break out of the DOM or start to like, I
Hmm.
mean, to me, I'm sort of like you can start with knock as being like
Hmm.
at least you have a simple foundation. The
Yeah.
rest of Arvo, okay, pretty good. There are things that can get better, but it's like relatively, at least it's compact, and we can work on the whole thing.
Yeah, it's
Um,
very minimal. Hmm.
but like once you get, I think that like level of like the clarity and completeness
Hmm.
isn't even there. Just at like I mean, it's pretty good. Like it's pretty good, but you can imagine it being so much better at the interface
Yeah.
level, such that yeah, it has that kind of like I don't know. There's just like a sense of it being fully like refined and like direct. But I
Yeah.
think
I mean, there is that deep
yeah,
desire to sort of imagine what designing in as solid a way as one would, you know, build out a solids model in SolidWorks might feel. Like if there was a world someday where Hoon was extended with a superset language that allowed you to describe interfaces in a very, very solid way that kind of did justice to the way that Nock and Hoon and Arvo and everything relates to one another in Urbit. Like that's magical for me. Like that's kind of like an ideal project that would someday be amazing for us to
yeah,
successfully execute. But
yeah,
you know, it's always steps. You know, we gotta work our way there.
yeah. The weird thing is always is that we live in this world. I was playing with the Apple II that we have the other day, like over
Hmm.
there,
Hmm.
uh, and we live in this world where the like level of polish of like our everyday software of like what I look
Hmm.
at on my monitors or whatever is extremely high. And so it's hard to you could like, build the entire thing and have your own rendering engine and whatever, even work on your own hardware, but you're just like a totally you, you're going to evolve relatively slowly, and you like break everyone's expectations about what like conventional
Hmm.
software does.
Yeah, yeah.
I used to think about this more, but I always felt like that trade-off was probably not. It was basically impractical. The funny thing about
At
Urban
this
is it's
time,
like I
yeah.
feel like it's like extremely opinionated, but very practical. And that would have been like a like too opinionated. The question is like how you get there, basically. But
Yeah, it's funny because we almost find ourselves in that reverse position where it's like we're working from sort of the hazy notion of what a cloud computer is in the sort of popular sense that people are familiar with it, and sort of as we further crystallize, you know, this has becoming something like possibly physical someday, where I think we have the classic sort of knock eventually freezing, becoming sort of frozen in its execution. Same with a lot of the other sort of stacks that actually constitute the core operating system, and how, you know, we are kind of like walking our way back to that experience of this thing being fully realized as a solid form possibly someday. I kind of find that a little bit inspiring in a way, you know, where we're kind of like a congealing maybe or annealing as like a project over
yeah, yeah,
time.
yeah, yeah. I mean, that's probably like back to the prior question or point about like, okay, what does it mean to build kind of like
Hmm.
truly sort of person-centric or whatever software?
Hmm.
I think it has to do with like, yeah, that you want that software has to um, become simpler over time.
Hmm.
Was like definitely part of it. I was trying to explain this to someone else the other day, and I was realizing that like the thing that people don't understand is that, or the people like don't understand anymore, I think, because it's almost like there's a difference between while Urban is
Hmm.
meant to be certainly a cloud computer,
Hmm.
it should run in the cloud. We don't
Hmm.
have the authority to unilaterally give it updates, right? So when we
Hmm.
ship software to it, we actually ship it there over the network, of course, but someone could turn that off at any point. And so like that
Easily.
act of shipping it just means like it's gone. You can't take it back, and you can't even necessarily fix bugs in it. And so it's like
Hmm.
just like a totally different way of thinking about, yeah, you need to give someone over what you're handing to someone is like almost physical, which is very
Yes.
characteristically different than like what you would normally do.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
Hmm.
don't think people understand that like if you do it in the normative way, which is like someone can update this at any time, you're handing
Hmm.
over, like you're making a compromise in terms of like control that is actually like not worth it, basically. But
Yeah,
they're
it's like,
different, totally like different things.
yeah, I mean, it's like a non-trivial amount of sort of like the promise that's being made there, and the way the law of software is handled is that the company or corporation that you're obtaining the software from will always have one of its appendages like in the sort of processing of that object that is, your software, which you can barely call an object at that point. It's like a sort of
Yeah, yeah,
extension of the company itself, which is something
yeah,
that is completely out of our hands at a certain point when it comes to how one operates, a personal orbit. Like
yeah,
I've made the sort of statement to a few people who asked the questions about the general network hierarchy and all that good stuff, that someone could just take a comet, take a planet, take whatever, and simply just run it out in the forest, and they could sever themselves off from the rest of society and
yeah,
operate this computer as purely P2P if they really wanted to. Like, this is something you could do now.
yeah,
um, it's something that has yet to really be leaned into culturally. Like, we're all still organizing around this sort of seed of development, but it's something
yeah,
that the software already affords for right this second,
yeah,
which is
yeah,
it's really cool. You know,
yeah. It's kind of interesting.
like, very few software can make that sort of statement that this thing is fully operable within sort of
Yeah,
my own influence if I really wanted it to be, which is
maybe
interesting.
SSB, maybe. But yeah, I think that's
Yeah,
totally
yeah.
true. All right, I think we should hang it up. I think
Okay.
that's pretty good. Like way to. I like try.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
like
This was fun.
forget, and then I'm like, wait, I'm getting hungry. And I'm like, oh, it's been an hour. I'm like, okay, that's why.
It's a good marker of time. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for doing this, man.
Yeah, this was fun. Always happy to chat about anything we discussed, or anything related to that with anyone. If anyone's listening right now. So,
Well, people can like, subscribe, and leave questions in the comments.
of course,
You-
as always.
That's the only. What kind of an influencer are you? It's the only way you can end a video.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Uh,
All right.
all right, that was fun. We'll do another one soon.
Yeah, let's do that.
All
Cool.
right, see ya.
Talk to you later. Bye bye.